Good afternoon, if you're on site with us, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Hopefully all the folks who have been dialing in remotely have had an amazing experience and we've learned a whole bunch. This has been quite possibly one of my favorite VeeamONs that we've done. It probably has nothing to do with the fact that the ransomware trends report debuted earlier this week. And Jeff, you and I have been talking about it all week. We just got out of a session on that as well, but it's been a good week.
It's been a fantastic week. It's always great being at day 2 of VeeamON. Fantastic keynotes, a lot of energy from our attendees. And as you said, we got to show everybody this year's brand new ransomware trends research in the Ransomware Trends 2024 report.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. So Veeam does individual research, and what we do is we actually use third-party independent analysts. These are not Veeam customers. Especially when we talk about the ransomware research, it's really important to remember, not Veeam customers, right? And the reason is because we ask hard questions to organizations, 1,200 organizations per year, third year in a row, who have suffered at least one cyber breach. Right, and so they had an attack. One of the key design goals for this research is that we have 3 different personas that are part of the survey. We have chief information security officers or a similar exec, someone who's a core stakeholder, ultimately accountable. We have security professionals, and then we have backup admins. So we have the folks, Jeff, that are responsible for prevention, the folks responsible for remediation, and maybe the person going to jail if it all goes bad. I mean, okay, the last part's a little bit colorful. But the point is that by looking at all 3 different personas, one of the more interesting things that we often find is when the 3 personas don't always agree on strategy, method, or even sometimes motive.
I've had conversations with customers here at VeeamON and with organizations that we're just talking to at conferences, at other events, and the level of disconnect between the security team and the infrastructure team, even now in 2024, continues to surprise me. We are not always on the same page with what we're doing there. The other thing that I'll point out, and Jason mentioned this before, it's important to point out when we talk about 1,200 organizations that suffered a breach, we're not talking about attempts to get on the network.
No.
What's happening with these breaches is that this is, because that happens hundreds of times a day. What happens is we're talking about organizations where the threat actor got on the network and attempted either successfully or unsuccessfully to set off a ransomware attack. That's the clientele, the population for this report.
They actually had to have some level of impact in order to be part of the process, which is actually probably a great way to look at our first slide. So this slide actually comes from the data protection trends report, not actually the ransomware one, but it actually drives the conversation overall. So each year in the data protection trends report, we ask, did your organization get hit by ransomware in the preceding 12 months? Jeff, take a look at the 2 boundary conditions. The green wedge, and I know we don't want to spend too much time on this because we're talking about the ransomware data, but the green wedge on that left-hand side says only 1 in 4 organizations believe, that's the key verb, that they have not been hit in the last 12 months. Talk about why believe is probably a little overly optimistic.
Well, we have actually an empirical data point on that. We came out with some enhancements to the Veeam data platform in version 12.1 that released in December of last year. And we had customers calling us back after they started implementing the YAR rule-based ransomware scanning that we included in that, saying, we found artifacts of an attack that didn't affect us, that were still on the network that we hadn't discovered at all. So the fact is, it is always wisest in 2024 to assume that a threat actor has breached your network and plan accordingly, and we actually have good empirical data that that's the case more often than folks think, unfortunately.
Yeah, and now while we don't actually measure this data point, we've seen a lot of organizations that, or other research firms actually, that have said things like the average gestation rate is 200 days from first breach until either the ransom was requested or artifacts were discovered along the way. So that's the best news is 1 in 4 have not been hit, right? Now let's take a look at the worst news, right? So if we look at the data, look at the red wedges on the right-hand side. In fact, that's 4 or more, right? So Jeff, you and I spend a lot of time in quarterly reviews, quarterly workshops, those kinds of quarterly events. Can you imagine having a permanent line item on the quarterly agenda what were the results of this quarter's ransomware attack? Because when you say 4 per year, that is the math.
That's exactly the math. The idea that we're in a situation now where more organizations are recovering from quarterly or more than quarterly ransomware attacks than are not getting hit is kind of appalling. It's really a scary number. And if you combine that with the average length of time as reported by us or as reported by other authorities in the surveys that they do, that it takes to recover from a ransomware attack, what you're basically dealing with is organizations for whom their primary business has now become being attacked and recovering from ransomware attacks.
Right.
That's what they do.
The good news is IT people have so much free time.
Right.
This kind of helps balance that out. So let me put a point on this, and if you're multitasking, I want you to look in my eyes, look at the data, and hear me on this. According to the data, more organizations got hit quarterly than believe they didn't get hit at all. Right? Let's repeat that for the folks at home, because you're going to write this down. More folks got hit quarterly than believe they didn't get hit at all. That is the context for why every year Veeam does this ransomware trends report. So let's get into the new data that kind of debuted this week. This is arguably the punchiest, scariest question, or actually maybe, let's call it this. This describes why everyone talks about ransomware. By the way, Veeam is not the only one who's talking about the importance of cyber and ransomware, but this describes why.
Exactly.
Let's talk about this for a second. So, organizations were asked, did you pay? And did it help? If you take the orange and the red, 81%, Jeff, 4 out of 5 organizations actually did write a check, do some Bitcoin, cash in some silver chips, whatever. 4 out of 5 paid. Now that's scary and a little bit foolish, but the part that actually bugs me is the red wedge, 27 out of 81. So you can think of this 2 ways. Mathematically, stick with me, 1 out of 4 paid but could not recover. Or the other way to think about it is, of those that paid, you went to your boss, you got the Bitcoin, you paid the attack. 1 out of 3 organizations who paid still could not recover. You spent a lot of time in this space. Talk to me through that.
So the fact is that threat actors optimize their processes for encrypting your data quickly without you noticing. They don't optimize their processes for recovery. In fact, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, a lot of you who follow Veeam might have seen the news that we acquired fairly recently one of the leading incident response firms that's out there, Coveware. What our new colleagues at Coveware have told us, because they specialize in nothing but incident response, is that frequently, because the threat actors' binaries are optimized to encrypt data quickly, they also corrupt the data that they're encrypting along the way. So even if they, in good faith, give you a decryption key that they think will work, a lot of times their software is shoddy, because all it's designed to do really is take your data away from you, not make sure it can give it back, and it actually corrupts the data, so it doesn't do you any good to buy a key, because your data can never be uncorrupted anyway. You really have only one option, which is recovering from backup.
I'm thinking back to those days when I have actually done a large zip file of my own. I had no intentions of encrypting myself. I just needed to zip my stuff up, and then the zip didn't unzip afterwards, and now think about that at scale.
Right.
And that's the problem statement. All right, so here's the other side of it though. Take a look at that really pretty little green wedge in the upper left-hand corner, right? 15%, so let's call that 1 out of 6. 1 out of 6 organizations said, no, we didn't pay. We recovered from backups, right? 15%. Literally, if I was in charge of marketing for a day, and I am not the CMO, I keep applying, they haven't returned my calls yet, but if I was in charge of Veeam marketing for a day, our mission statement is to help the other 85% say, no, we did not pay, we simply recovered our data.
This is exactly right, yep.
And now I get to find out if Rick Jackson actually watches these industry insights, because he's going to call me on this one. Anyway, so
and let's actually dig into one more stat here that I think is worth us looking at. Look at that top 4%. This is basically a number of folks where their data got encrypted by the threat actor, but even the worst option, paying a ransom wasn't an option for them.
Yeah.
This is an arson attack, essentially. And the absolute only way that they're going to get their data back is if they have a solid copy somewhere else on some other medium that they can get back, that they can recover after the attack.
Here are two stats that if you want to start a fresh conversation with your CISO or your board, these are the stats to use, right? So again, remember this is 1,200 organizations. On average, they got hit 2.1 times during the last year. So this is 1,200, so roughly 2,600 attacks. This is representative. And when those respondents were asked, how bad was it? On average, 41% of the production data set was affected. So 41%, it's a nice, lovely little number. Let me help you out with that. Call it 40, right? So 2 out of 5. 2 out of 5 hard drives. 2 out of 5 mailboxes. 2 out of 5 databases. Jeff, you and I are both proud dads, right? Think about if 2 out of 5 of your kids' pictures were shredded, right? You don't get to go back and take those again, right? How about 2 out of 5 of your grandparents' pictures when they were little? You don't get to go back and do those again. So 2 out of 5 of whatever matters to your business has now gone through a shredder. That's what the left-hand side stats. The right side says, okay, so 2 out of 5 went into the shredder of whatever it was. How much were you able to recover when everything was said and done? A little over half.
Right, exactly.
So, okay, if 2 out of 5 went in, 1 out of 5 came out. And so if you run the algebra on that, the actual math is 18% of your production data was irrevocably affected through this. That is the landscape we are trying to solve for.
And to put this in perspective around, for example, something that's not just of sentimental value.
Sure.
Let's talk dollars and cents. Let's imagine that 18% of the retirement accounts that you're managing are now gone, or 18% of your bank accounts are now gone. Right? These are real world impacts that affect huge numbers of organizations now.
How about 18% of your source code for the next version of the product?
Right.
18% of your past emails, and you have a legal compliance requirement for long-term retention. I mean, 18% of anything, right? No one has an extra 18% lying around. So, but wait, there's more bad news, right? So, if the whole idea is if you can't recover your data, you're going to lose about 1/6 of your production data set, then why wouldn't everyone recover? Well, it turns out the reason that not everyone recovers from backups is because for many organizations, the backup is no longer there, right? It's kind of like, we have a mutual friend, Leah. Imagine we're on a boat out in the middle of the ocean. We're off of Florida. Leah throws me in the water, right? Now, Leah wants to sell me a life preserver, okay? I'm not going to buy Leah's life preserver if I can swim back to the boat myself. I'm not going to buy the life preserver if I have something else floating near me that I can save myself. So if Leah wants to increase the ability for me to pay her ransom, she's going to remove my ability to save myself. And that is what the bad actors are doing, right? In 96% of cases, the backup repository is targeted by the bad actor. Now, 96%, so let's call it nearly all. But here's the problem. In 3 out of 4 attacks, the bad actor was successful. In 76% of cases, the backup repository was removed. So they lost the ability to save themselves, which meant their only option left was to recover the data.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly
right.
Or
to pay the ransom.
I won't look at Leah in quite the same way again going forward. Now that I know what a danger she is, I think you're exactly right. But let's talk about this. So there were times when Veeam customer support was talking with organizations 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when they would be saved by storage snapshots that were not immutable,
right,
where they would be saved by copies of data that happened to have been written up to cloud repositories, but were not immutable. Threat actors are very sophisticated. That time has passed. At this point, they are very good at compromising admin credentials for your cloud tenants. They're good at doing it for your storage environments, for all the administrative environments you have. And so what you need to do, and again, we'll return, I know it's an overused phrase, but we'll talk about zero trust and the basic principle of assuming breach. It is likely that an adversary is on your network, or that you should plan as though they're on your network, and you should guard your data such that even if they do crack Active Directory,
Sure.
crack your storage credentials, they still can't delete your backups.
By the way, just in full disclosure, I know you had 4 sessions yesterday, so you were pretty slammed on Tuesday. But Leah was actually on one of my industry insights yesterday, which is why I had to pick on her today. So we'll see if she watches this one. Anyway, so there's another stat that we want to kind of lean into, and that is, I think a lot of folks assume that either you're going to wave this magic wand and decrypt the data, or that you're going to type in this key and, you know what, I know what we'll do. We'll just wipe all the servers out and we'll start that last backup and get it going again. That's probably the right answer, except the data says that in 31% of cases, that's not the right answer and you're not going to be able to. Right? So one of the questions that was actually added new for the Ransomware 2024 report was, did you have anything that prohibited you from simply wiping a server and starting over, right? So maybe it's forensics, right? Maybe it's security. The one I actually think about most, though, is, Jeff, I know you're probably a perfect driver. I've actually had a couple fender benders over time, and the insurance guy wouldn't let me go and start to fix my car until they came out and took pictures.
Right.
Right. So and if you have insurance, this is that same kind of plausibility where, for when organizations were asked, were you prohibited? On average, and I think there's 2 ways to look at this, only 1 in 7, 14%, said no, I had no problems, I could wipe everything. 1 in 7. For 6 out of 7, there was at least some that were precluded. And on average, 31% of the infrastructure was not allowed to simply be wiped and recovered.
Right.
31%. So what are you going to do? You have an extra 31% of infrastructure sitting around?
Well, no one does. And the supply chain issues that we were all dealing with during the pandemic have not eased as much as we all would have hoped.
Right.
There's no one that wants to go to their elected leadership if you're in public sector, or to your executive or financial leadership and say, it's okay, let's wait 6 weeks for a new shipment of servers and storage to get here on a container ship, right? No one wants to hear that. Practically speaking, we still find that too few organizations have planned for the eventuality that when it's time for them to recover, almost a third of the infrastructure that they're used to using, whether it's in their primary cloud tenant or in their data center or at a remote office, is no longer going to be available for them to work with. So if your incident response playbook doesn't include the idea that you're going to have to recover some number of workloads,
right.
And by the way, you don't know which of those workloads in advance, right? It's a third. We don't know which third. You need the ability to recover those either to a net new environment in a local cloud provider or a colo, or into a net new environment in a hyperscale cloud, where you know it's not compromised by the threat actor and you can recover safely.
Sure. You know, you mentioned elected officials, right? And I forget how much time you spend in federal solid accounts. I can just imagine going to a 2-star and saying, sir, we're going to need some new servers in theater.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah, for all the reasons. And one of the questions that's actually in the ransom report, so by the way, you're going to see the QR code in the upper right-hand corner of all of our data. Please go download the report. And you'll find out that most organizations today, as a lesson learned moving forward, now are able to actually either recover to secondary infrastructure in another location, which can help. But by the way, if you can get that second location, so can the bad actor. Anyway, or alternatively to cloud-hosted infrastructure. And anyone who follows me on Twitter knows I'm a massive fan of DRaaS as an option for that. Okay, but we've got more.
Let's dig in more.
Let's dig in more. So let's take a look at the next piece of data. And okay, sorry about that, minor technical glitch. That's how you know it's live. All right, so we've talked about, okay, now you're gonna, if your backup survived, AKA immutability, air gapping, offline, and if you have secondary infrastructure at another data center, you wiped your metal or brought up something cloudy. I think one of the pressures that we often hear about, and you've done some tabletops, so I'd love to get your opinion on this. One of the pressures that you often hear is you've got C-levels all around you going, when are we going to be back up again? We got to be back up again. And there is a human nature to cut a couple corners. How quick can I get this up? Surely I don't need all the steps, kind of thing. And for a lot of organizations, that runs the risk of reinfection. Can you talk about what you've seen from either the tabletops or the real world of mitigation, and then let's take a look at what the data says.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. The fact is, for the first time at VeeamON this year, on Monday before the official beginning, we had about 6 Veeam customers come, and we went through a ransomware response tabletop exercise. This was on Monday of this week. It was fascinating to sit down. I was one of the facilitators who sat down at the table with 6 customers.
So jealous.
Walked through this.
So jealous.
It was really great, and this kind of realizing how many different people in your organization and outside, which we'll touch on in just a minute, have to be involved in that process is something that folks still have not fully come to terms with.
Right.
And you're right, there's a lot of pressure to solve the problem now. There's a lot of people who are not technical, not security oriented, but they know that the economic cost of the outage, that the potential bad exposure is adding up second by second, and they want to fix now. And what that leads to, as we can see in this data set, is that it is the minority of organizations that actually have a good plan to quarantine the workloads that they're recovering before they put them back on the network.
Right. Now, let's be honest. Quarantining, sandboxing, staged restore, whatever you call the technical voodoo that makes that happen, it's not easy.
Right.
Right? You know, it is not an easy thing to say, okay, I'm going to restore into this isolated. How do you restore into something that's isolated, right? I mean, that alone is kind of a flawed ask. Right? But you restore into something that's isolated, then you run some kind of scan to make sure that it's clean, and then you don't want to wait for a human to say, okay, it's green, I can go and push that forward. So now you're then staging that and putting it out again. It's not easy.
Right.
But if you don't do it,
then we get back to the 26% of organizations that responded to the data protection trend survey that got hit by ransomware 4 times or more. It is very disheartening, and again, I've had multiple conversations with our new colleagues at Coveware. It is very disheartening to be through 3 weeks of a recovery process with your outside counsel, your inside counsel, outside PR teams, everyone from your senior leadership team, everyone from your technical team, every vendor on the IT and security side you have, all working together for 3 weeks, and then boom, the hammer comes down again, you've reinfected yourself, and you're back to square one. And it is distressing, but that is a real thing that actually happens.
Oh yeah. You know, I think about it this way, you know, I did not have a pleasant middle school experience when I was growing up. And when the school bully has asked you for your lunch money, right, and you paid him, the next time the school bully wants money, he knows you're willing to pay, and some of the others might not be. And so if you haven't closed all the loops, if you haven't patched all the holes, if you haven't locked things down, if you have restored stuff that has dormant malware in it, then the bully is going to come and ask you for more lunch money again. Amen?
Yep, exactly, exactly.
I will also point out, by the way, you know, you're talking about this tabletop exercise. Super jealous. I didn't get invited to your Monday session, so maybe next year along the way. But I will always remember one of the first tabletops I was in, and the whole team was there, and executive leadership was there, and everyone was good. And the host who was facilitating the tabletop said, okay, so anyone need to say any words, you know, groundwork for how the day is going to go? This person steps up, he talks for a few minutes, lays the land, and then he says, okay, great. One last thing, you're no longer in the room. So the person who knew how everything was going to come together, had orchestrated all the teams, was removed, right?
Even something as fundamental as we have unified communications. We have our act together in terms of comms. We've been very efficient, but now our unified communications are down. How do we even contact our vendors?
Oh yeah.
What system of record do we have where we know how to reach the people that we have to reach? If we knew which FBI field office we should be calling, for example, if law enforcement's going to get involved, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I did a week-long event up at MIT on crisis management last year. There's another one coming up this year, which I'm going back to in June. And that's one of the first things they looked at was breakdowns in communication and where that goes from there. All right, so we've got a little bit more data that we want to share along the way. So we've been talking about not reinfecting, but there's a couple other pieces that kind of come into this. If we're going to talk about team, let's talk about the fact that not only is there a communication breakdown, but even when everything is working, before the disaster, before the malware, before the ransom is asked for, turns out most of the players on the team don't think things are going well. Jeff, I want to kind of draw out two things in this data. So the question was, how much do you believe the organization needs to improve between just the IT backup and the cyber teams? And you've already mentioned like half a dozen other teams that aren't in that math, right? But if we just talk about the prevention team and the remediation team, how well aligned are they? On average, 63% of the respondents, remember all three personas were surveyed on this one, 63%, so roughly 3 out of 5, said either significant improvements or a complete overhaul is needed in order to fix those two teams. Now, Jeff, this week, and we've got security folks here, we've got CISOs here, CEOs, CIOs here, we've also got a lot of backup folks. Does it surprise you that I think it's 75%, so it's disproportionately higher, the backup admins were the least satisfied with the collaboration with the other two groups that are involved in this? Does that surprise you?
It actually doesn't surprise me at all. What we have found consistently is when we talk with security hands-on practitioners, IT infrastructure, that is backup hands-on practitioners, those two groups tend to be the most skeptical of how the cooperation, of how the communication is working. The further folks get, and this is understandable, it's human nature.
Sure.
The further folks get from being directly hands-on with the process, the more they assume that everything is working as it should. But to your point, it's the actual backup professionals, the people who are in charge of the restores, the people who are in charge of securing the backups themselves, who have the most trepidation that things are actually being secured the way they need to be.
Yeah, one of the things that I love that we do at VeeamON is we do have an exec track. And one of the things that the exec track talked about was, when you are a little bit further removed, and from the details, I didn't say naivety in the room, right? Because I like to keep my job. But there was this sense of, I didn't realize it was that bad. I need to go have some hard conversations with my team leaders on, are we as aligned on the teams as we are in the strategy or the playbook overall? So that was certainly one of my key takeaways from the exec track earlier this week.
Yeah.
All right, so we're talking just about the internal teams. There's one more data point I want to share, and again, you're living in this world, so let's put some color on this. So one of the things that was asked was, did you involve any third parties? Now, Jeff, first take a look at that little bitty orange wedge in the very bottom, right? 6% said they did not engage any third parties as part of their remediation. That means 94% chose one or more of the third parties that are out there right now. Take me through this.
Well, first off, I would love to meet the 6%, just like I would love to meet the 1% that don't have any problems between their security and infrastructure team, right? These are great. But in the real world, for most human beings, if you take a look at the top, the first two groups of folks that are always going to be involved basically in this kind of situation is your backup vendor and your cybersecurity vendor, right? It makes sense. These are obviously the shock troops that are immediately dealing with the attack. However, you also have, from the outside teams, all of your other technology vendors. You have forensic analysis, you have incident response teams like our new colleagues at Coveware, who are actually responsible for quarterbacking the whole response and, if necessary, coordinating, dealing with the threat actor.
Sure.
All these are roles that have to be filled. And it's important to recognize that you need to do this. It's very important in terms of realistic timeframes for recovery, because if I have to quarterback half a dozen different teams being in the same room at the same time, if a vendor comes to me and says, if you get hit by ransomware 10 minutes later, you'll be fully recovered like it never happened, there's a good chance they're telling me what I want to hear, not what the real truth is about the situation.
So that they might actually be willing to pay that Bitcoin after all. Yesterday, Dave Russell and I were on an Industry Insights, and one of our slides that we talked about for that one was 47% of the respondents in that survey intended to change jobs over the next year. So when you think about, and we talked about how that could be a lot of risk, right? What if the smartest guy in the room is just no longer employed?
Like your scenario just now.
Sure.
Congratulations, you're out of the room.
Right. Now that could be loss of life. That could be there's a flood and so I'm bailing my living room as opposed to bailing the data center. Or it could just be, you know what, I found another gig. Not my problem anymore, right? And one of the things we also talked about in that was one of the best ways to mitigate risk, and that's what we're here for, right, is to lean into third parties that can broaden your bench, right? And now you're buying expertise on tap.
And you mentioned before, I work a lot with public sector customers. Public sector, in particular state and local government, there's a lot of situations where those folks don't have the cyber expertise or the infrastructure expertise that they might like to have. If you think of school systems, if you think of universities, I've heard so many times, we got somebody trained up who started at entry level and they left and they're earning 50% more working for a security company now. So being able to actually rely on third-party vendors who are going to have a stable bench of professionals to help you out with this should be a key part of your incident response planning. And the good news is, you can see from this, a lot of folks have learned that lesson.
Totally. And I love the fact that certainly, it's a little self-serving, but not only is as backup vendor, and that is in Veeam green, that is not an accident on that particular bar of the chart. Certainly we've made some more security partnership announcements, so I like those are also in the green as well. It is also not an accident. The two blue wedges, right? Forensics, ransom negotiation, that happens to be code for blue.
Right.
I'm just saying, right?
That's right.
All right. Again, the whole goal of all of this data is to help you have new conversations, right? So your homework, whether you are on site this week for when you get back, or if you are remote, is between your executive stakeholders, your security professionals, and then the backup admins, is have those conversations on, are we aligned as a team? Are we aligned as a playbook? What would it look like if 41% of our data went into a meat grinder? What would it look like if you couldn't get 18% back? How are we making sure that our backup repositories are in the 20% that didn't get it? I mean, there are some honest, hard questions that folks ought to be taking away from that. If you haven't downloaded it yet, because we're making a lot of hay on it this week, please go download that report. Jeff, I'm going to give you the last words before we sign off. We've had 3,000 people on site, I think, at least it seems like that, and then umpteen tens of thousands online. What would you tell the folks at home? What's that one last thing that they need to plan for on cyber resiliency?
I would just say, planning for a cyber incident does not begin when you find out that you've been compromised. It begins in the boardroom, it begins with executive and financial stakeholders, and with a whole bevy of folks outside that you're going to need to engage. So the sooner you start planning on that, the better. And if you need ammunition to make those talks happen, I hope that this research will give you a little bit of extra leverage to make that happen.
Couldn't have said it better. It's been a great week. Love spending it with you. On behalf of all of Veeam, I think this is our last of the industry insights from on-site at VeeamON this week. We hope you got stuff out of it. Starting next week, we'll be doing live streams in our normal Tuesday noon US East Coast time. I think we've got like 6 or 7 weeks planned for that, and we're going to look at one chunk of data at a time to help you become more cyber resilient so that you can be radically bouncing forward, right? So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you Tuesday starting next week. Take care.
Thanks all.